Hi there. I'm very excited to be able to present you with a presentation on a topic that is very interesting and is based on a theory called Evolutionary Alarm Sounds within languages. The title of the presentation is Change the World, Make the World Prosperous. It is a psychological perspective and it is based on my work, Chris Oszywa, and I am a psychologist and I am also a linguist. So the question here is, how do we move from poverty to prosperity? And it is not only the extreme poverty as we see on the picture on the left, but poverty is also found in many other countries which are struggling economically. For instance, there is a lot of poverty in Brazil and Argentina and even countries like Russia. Although they are functioning, they are kind of struggling to be as developed and competitive as the Western societies. So the challenge is, how do we move from poverty to prosperity? Many theories have been put forward, but they have all been very similar in that they all suggest bigger investments in infrastructure, education, and so forth. But none of them have really offered an explanation why, for instance, Brazil is not as competitive as United Kingdom, or why India is struggling economically in comparison to the fast growth of China. And in this presentation, I will demonstrate a very comprehensive and applicable theory on this topic. To address this question, let us begin by looking at a graph, which is often referred to as the inverted U-curve. And it's based on a Wundt curve, which is a universally applicable phenomena. And in this case, it deals with performance. So this graph on the vertical line represents performance. And in this case, we are talking about society's performance in terms of its ability to maintain and improve its economy, making sure that all parts of the economy run well, such as education, health, transport, manufacturing, service industry. While the horizontal line represents arousal. Arousal can be referred to how alert we are to dangerous stimuli in our environment, and how nervous we are, how cautious we are. And the key word is how much we worry or how much we focus on those aspects of society. So as you can see in the graph, when we have low arousal, and low arousal is often seen as being relaxed, happy, and so forth, performance is low. And as the arousal increases the performance increases as well. However, when the arousal is too high and when we are too nervous, then often that nervousness, that arousal, cripples performance. So let's have a look at the inverted U-curve now and the arousability of different societies in the world in terms of their performance. So the question is, which countries or which societies appear to be very relaxed, where they don't look nervous, they don't look too worried, they are very talkative, and they like to interact with other people, where they have big smiles, and they are not really shy. And those societies appear to be pretty much on the low arousal side of the inverted U-curve, and the stereotypical description of those societies is that they are usually sub-Saharan African people, as you can see on the images, and they are described as often as being Indian or Latinos or Arabic people in Arabic countries. So in terms of this inverted U-curve, it shows that perhaps the performance is a little bit low. And then on the other extreme, you have Asiatic societies such as China and Japan, and they are described as being very nervous and shy and focused and introverted. And somewhere in between this arousability between the low and the high are the Western societies, and they are often described as being not too relaxed and not too nervous. They are worried, but they are able sometimes to relax and enjoy their life. And perhaps because of that, their performance is perhaps the closest to the optimum on this inverted U curve. And one could pretty much argue that because of that, it was the Western societies that developed the modern civilization and things like the high-rise buildings, cars, mobiles, and so forth. In terms of the inverted U curve, for the world to become prosperous, the society's arousal level needs to be closer to the middle or closer to the optimal performance. Now, this increase in arousal from the low arousal is most important, but there are some societies like, as I've mentioned earlier, Brazil, Argentina, and some ethnic groups that actually need also to raise their arousal in order for them to be able to really become prosperous. A lot of those societies are on the verge of being able to develop. However, they always seem to struggle in terms of being well organized and efficient and not corrupt and so forth. And that would be achieved if their arousal level is closer to the optimal. On the other hand, we have some societies which are extremely highly aroused, such as China and Japan. And in terms of prosperity, in today's world, they can easily and quickly imitate the slightly less aroused Western society. So in terms of wealth, they can, in a lot of cases, outcompete the medium aroused societies. Now, in the past, this arousal was considered to be genetic in nature, and what I will show in this presentation is that you can actually alter this arousal level in a society by changing the language that that particular society speaks. So what is this difference in arousal? Which part of the brain controls this arousal, and can we actually quantify this concept of arousal? Well, to answer this question, one of the earliest people that recognized differences in arousal was Ivan Pavlov, and he did that while he was doing his research on conditioning, and he was looking for experimental animals which would easily condition, and he realized that actually the easiest dogs to condition were the ones that were the most shy, the most introverted. And he then realized that those animals conditioned very well. And on the other hand, he realized that animals which were extroverted, which were friendly, which were full of life, they conditioned very poorly. Now, taking this a step further and developing the theory was a person called Hans Eysenck, and he actually quantified the whole concept and identified which part of the brain controls this arousal. And he identified that it was one of the earlier brain structures in the limbic system that was responsible for the arousal, and he describes differences in the way stimuli are perceived in terms of people who are highly aroused. They perceive stimuli differently than people who are low aroused, and some of those differences he describes in his book, Biological Differences in Personality, and he looks at the conditioning Then he shows that there are differences in the brainwave, EEG brainwaves. There is differences in sensory deprivation, and some other studies show that there is also differences in attentional bias. So we can clearly identify this arousal concept, and here I have a short video of Hans Eysenck describing this concept of arousal.
Everyone is familiar introspectively with different degrees of arousal. When you are doing an examination, you're in a high state of arousal. When you're coming home tired and sit in front of the television, you're in a low state of arousal, and you probably recognize states intermediate between these two. But in addition to that, there are also habitual differences in level of arousal in the resting state between individuals. Some habitually have a high level of cortical arousal, and some have a low level. And it is this that is related to extroversion, introversion.
Now let's have a look how this difference in arousal shapes personality traits. Now, Hans Eysenck, in his book Biological Basis of Personality, describes that there are physiological differences in the way the stimuli are perceived and responded to, and some of those differences are ease of conditioning, transmarginal inhibition, EEG brainwaves, sensory deprivation, and some other that he doesn't describe include negative attentional bias differences. Now, what happens is, because a person has these different ways of processing information, and in the very young age, when that person interacts with the environment, the person with high arousal will develop different personality traits in comparison to a person with low aroused level. Now, those differences are shown on the graph, and low arousal individuals, they come across as cool, laid back, outgoing. They are relaxed, they don't worry, they don't care. They are very extroverted, sociable, warm. They are very confident, they have high self-esteem, and often because of that they can come across as stubborn. Now, the other extreme of really high aroused individuals, they are very shy, nervous, anxious, they worry, they are very cautious, they are introverted, they often come across as loners and cold, but they are very obedient, they have low self-esteem, and they are very polite. So this can be then related to the inverted U curve and different societies in the world, and they are very descriptive of what is happening at the moment in different societies throughout the world. Some of the personality traits of highly aroused individuals or society are advantageous for prosperity, and these personality traits of high arousal include worry. So high aroused individuals worry a lot more, and you can obviously see how worry would be good for a society, because if you worry, well, you make sure that you turn up on time, you worry, you make sure that everything functions well, and so forth. And so that's a very important personality trait that is a result of high arousal. Another one important for prosperity would be negative attentional bias. By this we mean that highly aroused individual or a group recognize little things in the environment as potential dangers, and so they attend to them and they fix them and they improve them. And a low aroused society will not even recognize them and will not even attend to them. So again, you can see how that personality trait would be advantageous for prosperity. Another one is the ease of conditioning, and Pavlov was the first one to to describe that phenomena, and then Hans Eysenck related it to the society, where he stated that highly conditioned individuals or societies are easily conditioned to follow rules and laws and not to be corrupted. So again, this is advantageous to economical prosperity and transmarginal inhibition. Hans Eysenck describes that highly aroused individuals or societies, introverted people, are not easily bored with monotonous and tedious things. So you can again see how that is important in education, where a highly aroused individual can sit there and keep studying for long periods of time, or they can manufacture phones and sit there and do repetitive things, while low aroused individual will not pay attention to it. Now, the point that I would like to mention and stress here is that this arousal, this high arousal, you cannot educate it, as it is a function of the nervous system, and this is the key reason why a lot of programs to help poor countries have not worked, is that they have tried to educate the individuals or the society, but the key was that what we need to do is we need to raise the arousal level of those societies. And in the following slides, I will show how that can be achieved. How do we raise the arousal of the individual or the group? Well, one of the ways to do that would be to scare the individual. And we could do it by screaming. And here's an example of a female scream. Now, this sound of a scream is automatically picked up by our reptilian core, by our early brain structures, and it increases our arousal automatically, as it's the structure of the scream is pre-programmed into our nervous system to increase our arousal. Now, this arousal from the scream would be temporary in nature, and with time our arousal would return to the restive state. But what we are interested in increasing is the arousal level of the restive state, and this is the question: how do we do that? So the scream would raise the arousal level of the individual. Now, the reason it raises the arousal level of the individual is because the scream has a physiological structure that is common among all the animals along the evolutionary scale. So the scream is similar and is picked up by the reptilian core, and it's very similar among monkeys, rats, birds, and many other animals. And it has similar structure, and you can see the diagrams next to the images. And what is characteristic about those type of distress sounds is that they have a prolonged sound, and they have a dark band, which is characteristic of a valve type of a sound. And I will demonstrate how those sounds are similar across different animals. And the first sound is that of a monkey scream. The second sound is that of a baby crying.
And the third sound is that of a parrot distress sound. Now all those sounds have a distressing effect on us. The reason that they do is that they have a physiological structure which affect our reptilian core of our brain, our early brain structure. Now the point in this slide is that this type of sounds can be present within syllables of a language. And the point here then is that if there is a lot of such sounds in a language, what it does is it raises the arousal level of the society or the individual in which the individuals or the people grow up in. So it raises the arousal, and I will show how that happens in the next slides. So here we have examples of a scream or the distress warning sounds in 3 different English words. And the way to recognize this distress, this scream quality, which is picked up by the reptilian core, is the dark folaments or bands in the spectrograms. And in these cases we have 3 words, fey, yell and by, and it's the valve diphthongs, the 2 valves together, the A, the yell and the I, that are picked up by the reptilian core as the distress, the scream sounds, and then the neurocortex, the more recent brain, picks up the meaning of those words. So the word is picked up on 2 different levels. The sound is picked up by the reptilian core in terms of its distress value, and then the neurocortex picks up the meaning. Here's an example of a whole sentence in the English language which has alarm, scream, distress type sounds which are picked up by the reptilian core. And this particular sentence is, where are you going? And virtually there are dark bands in every syllable of that sentence. So again, English language has, you can deduct from this, has quite a lot of sounds which are picked up by the reptilian core and which raise the arousal level of the society. Here we have example of 3 English words which do not have alarm distress qualities in them, and the reason they do not is because their formants, the dark band in the spectrograms look very short and not harsh in its nature. And so the 3 words here we have he, to, thee, and those 3 words are not picked up by the reptilian core as distress or warning sounds. They do not raise the arousal level of the individual. They are only picked up by the neurocortex in terms of their meaning. So English language has words which do not have scream distress qualities, and they do have words which have distress and warning qualities, and that concentration is, as will be shown later in the slides, is relatively high in comparison to some of the other languages. Here we have an example of a comparison between English language and Spanish language, where English language has relatively more alarm, scream, distress sounds than Spanish language, and so the English language stimulates the reptilian core more, creating a higher arousal in the society in comparison to the Spanish language. And the example is taken out of my book Evolutionary Alarm Sounds Within Languages, where I have a paragraph, and this paragraph starts with, there are many alarm or scream type of sounds in English speaking language. And here I have highlighted in bold which parts of the words have this distress warning quality, and in the red is the respective phonetic sound of that distress warning sound, which stimulates the reptilian core. And the same thing I have done with the Spanish comparable paragraph. Now, what you can see is that in the English paragraph there are 42 words, and there are 33 sounds with this distress warning quality out of possible 64 sounds. Now, the same paragraph in Spanish has only 12 alarm distress sounds out of possible 83. So you can see the difference in the amount of this warning distress sounds that affect the reptilian core and that raise the arousal level. Now let's look at how many alarm and distress sounds different languages in the world contain. And it's very interesting to note that this concentration of this alarm distress sounds correlate very well with the arousability of different societies in the world. So, for instance, Mandarin Chinese has well over 90% of its words and syllables with alarm distress qualities in them, which are actually very intense. And so the population in that speaks Mandarin Chinese is very aroused, and in comparison to that, societies which are low aroused actually speak languages which have very few distress warning scream type of sounds, which are picked up by the reptilian core. And then in the middle, English, Dutch and German has kind of about 45 to 60% of its syllables with alarm distress qualities. So their personality, their temperament is kind of in between. So from this we can deduct that there is a connection between language and arousal level. To change the arousal of a society, we need to change the language. And as I have described earlier, in terms of the inverted U-curve, what we want to do is we want to move the societies which have low arousal towards the optimal performance level in terms of arousal, and then societies which are perhaps too aroused, we want to reduce them a little bit so that they all are also closer to the optimal performance in terms of the inverted U-curve. And we do that by changing the intensity and the concentration of the alarm, distress, or scream type sounds, which stimulate the reptilian core and raise the arousal level. So how do we change a language to change the arousal level of a society? And a number of people have asked me this question, and they have commented that it would be very difficult to change a language of a society. However, it is much easier than it seems. And here's an example of an English word and how to alter it so it could include alarm, this distress quality, which affects the reptilian core and raises the arousal level.
So the example here is the word is, and it in itself doesn't have an alarm quality because the I sound is quite short, the formants and the quality is not picked up by the reptilian core. Now, how do we alter it? Well, we could add an A sound at the beginning of it, and then the sound would be eyes, and then the I quality would then constitute a scream distress quality, and it would be picked up by the reptilian core. Another example would be to put an L sound after the I, and it would sound as eels, and again it would have a distress quality. And another example would be to have a long I sound, as in eyes. So there is quite a number of different ways to increase the distress to quality in a sound, and that is beyond the scope of this presentation. But to achieve that is relatively simple, and the language would perhaps sound as a dialect of the original language. How many words do we need to change to increase or decrease the arousal level of a society? Well, to do that, we need to look at what is called word frequency lists. And for instance, the most common 25 words in the English language constitute about 33% of the language, while the first 100 words, about 50%, and then the most commonly used 1,000 words, about 90% of the language. So we need to concentrate on those words to have the biggest impact. And in this slide, I have presented the 10 most frequent used words in both English and Spanish, and I have shown which words already have distress alarm calls qualities, and and that is highlighted in the bold and corresponding the phonetic alphabet in the red. And then I have also shown the words that would need to have a letter added to it so that the word has a scream distress quality which stimulates the reptilian core and increases the arousal level. And so perhaps we would be looking at about 40 to 50% of words of the most common 1,000 words in the word frequency list to have a significant impact on the arousal level of that society. Now, there is a dimension that we need to take into consideration when we're considering arousal in different societies, and that is the dimension of pigmentation. It appears that there are genetic differences depending on how much pigment or melanin we have in our skin. The less pigment a person has, the lighter the skin, which is then more sensitive to the sun. And interestingly, as the skin is more sensitive to the sun, so is the organism more sensitive or more aroused to stimuli. So in this diagram, we have the inverted U-curve, and I have on the left-hand side, I have pointed that there are slight differences between the natural arousal level of different races of people. So the people that are so-called black, they seem to have a slightly lower arousal level and naturally more extroverted, more happy. Then the so-called brown skin people are a little bit higher. Then we have the Asiatic, so some people call them yellow skin people in the past. And then we have the white skin people there. What is interesting to note in this graph is that language then stimulate or increase the arousal level in conjunction to the skin natural arousal level of the race. So, for instance, when we look at the so-called yellow skin people, we have the Chinese or Mandarin Cantonese speaking people, and that the language, you can see the long arrow, red arrow, the language increases their arousal level to very high. While in comparison to that, there are other yellow skinned people such as Filipinos and Mongolians, and their language do not have very much scream, distress, alarm qualities in them. So the language doesn't move them much further in terms of their arousal level. So they are kind of a lot more extroverted and talkative and happy and so forth. And because of that, their performance, economical performance, is less than the Chinese group of people. And similarly, you can see an example here of the so-called white-skinned people. And this distinction here is between the German or Germanic speakers and the Russian speakers. So the German language has relatively more alarm distress sounds, so it moves that society much closer to the optimal performance, while the Russian language doesn't have much alarm distress quality. So they kind of not high enough in terms of their arousal to be prosperous, but they kind of can function, but it's always a little bit of a struggle. So the last slide was essential for us to be able to understand the dynamics, the differences, for instance, in the United States, that there are, even though United States is very developed, there are groups of people that are struggling economically. And that is because the English language does not cause enough arousal increase in the so-called more darker skinned people in America. So they, as a group, are less aroused than the optimal, while the arousal of the English language might be sufficient for the white-skinned person to be closer to the optimal level of arousal in terms of performance. So basically what needs to be done is, for the darker skinned people, we need a more intensely alarmed language with more intense distress scream sounds in it, and then what we do is we bring that society, that group of people, closer to the optimal performance, and we achieve prosperity. Acknowledging these differences might seem between races might seem discriminatory. However, only when we take it into consideration can we actually make the difference, make the prosperity. Denying this difference and attacking research prevents prosperity and leaves those people who are struggling in miserable condition. It also causes frustration, because if you say that everybody is equal and they are not achieving that equality, then they will get angry. To summarize the presentation, the goal of it was to show how to make the world prosperous. And to do that, we looked at the inverted U-curve, where on the horizontal axis we had the arousal and then the performance on the vertical axis. And the issue was for the arousal to be close to optimum performance, and that some societies have low arousal, and because of that their performance economically is not that good. And so
what we want to achieve is raise the arousal closer to the optimal performance so that the society can become prosperous. And to do that, what we need to do is increase the scream, distress warning type sounds in the language of that low aroused society, so that the sounds stimulate the reptilian core and raise the arousal level of that particular society, and thereby allowing that society to become prosperous. So what is the next step and then the application of this theory? Well, the application of the theory would involve creating a pilot program where a society, say a city in a country which is relatively undeveloped, would adopt a slightly altered language, which would sound a little bit like a dialect. And this altered language would have an increase of significant increase of this scream, distress, alarm qualities, which would supposedly raise the arousal level of the society, and thereby allowing them to become economically developed. And so the pilot would then involve a number of years and an observation to see if there is a significant difference in performance in terms of economical prosperity. The next step or development of this theory would also include more research or significant amount of research in this area. Now, research in this area has been very restricted because the study of differences between different groups and cultures and races and so forth has been very much attacked in the past. So even very basic research has not been conducted for a long time. And further, this theory that is presented here is global in nature, and it is similar in its globality, in its application to that of the theory of evolution presented by Darwin, in that, for instance, it has economic implication where we can predict economical development of countries, and we can say which countries will become developed and which countries will not become developed due to the arousal level of those societies. In terms of education, and it, for instance, explains why Far East students study the hardest, because they have the highest arousal and they worry the most. So the parents push them, they concentrate better because they are not bored by studies and so forth. And further, there is a historical perspective on this theory and application in terms of understanding why it was the Europeans that developed the modern civilizations. You can also look at old civilizations and now look at them and understand what level of development they had, if you can sort of decipher the language that they spoke, and we can then work out how many alarm or distress sounds those languages had, and then we can predict their arousal level. Another important aspect which has not been addressed in this presentation is that there is a distress warning quality that is picked up by the reptilian core, but another sound that also is pre-programmed into our nervous system is the aggressive sound. And that aggressive sound then has an impact on increasing our testosterone level and our aggression. And it appears that Middle East has, the Arabic language in particular, has a lot of this kind of aggressive sounds in it, and those sounds are the glottal sounds that are produced like and in the back of the throat. And so the implications are that
that society has perhaps more aggression, more testosterone, and as a result, they have more conflicts in their culture. And another language which also has potentially aggressive sounds is the Korean language, and this aggressive quality is achieved through its plosives, which are very extreme, and they are common in other animals, in that they represent aggression as well. So those two, this aggressive phenomena then has an impact on a lot of issues which need to be further researched. So I would suggest setting a foundation which would coordinate this application and this research, and hopefully we could get some funding for it so we can move this idea forward. And I would suggest a name for this new field of study, and I would call it Silintics. And if you have any ideas, comments, suggestions, please contact me directly, and my email is chris@languagesounds.com. Thank you very much for listening to this presentation.